The year is 793 AD. The world is small, dark, and defined by fear. Then, a single devastating truth arrived on the tide. The Northmen are here. Forget the history books. Forget the Hollywood myths of horned helmets and blind savagery. The true story of the Viking Age is not about chaos. It is about systemic genius. It is about the technology that made them masters of the sea, the ruthless economic ambition that drove them from the frozen fjords of Norway to the gold-plated walls of Constantinople, and the sheer geopolitical audacity that allowed a society of farmers and fishermen to rewrite the map of Europe. They didn't just raid. They traded. They didn't just plunder. They ruled. They carved out the Danelaw in England, founded Kievan Rus, the future of Russia, and discovered North America centuries before Columbus. Their legacy is not just the ruin they left behind, but the DNA running through the veins of modern Europe, and the words we speak every single day for 250 years. They were unstoppable. This is the 30,000 word, definitive account of the Viking Age, the epic true story of how the Northmen conquered the world, and why their history still haunts our present. Asterisk, look at the waves. They define the story. The popular image of the Viking is a brute in a horned helmet, a savage driven by bloodlust and blind pagan rage. Forget it. Immediately. That is a Victorian myth, a romanticized lie, an historical forgery. The reality is infinitely more complex, infinitely more terrifying, and ultimately, infinitely more historically important. The Viking Age, spanning roughly 793 AD to 1066 AD, was not an invasion by a single monolithic empire, but an explosion of economic, political, and demographic pressures from Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These people were not merely raiders. They were the ultimate geopolitical actors, explorers, traders, mercenaries, slavers, and lawmakers. They were driven by silver, land, power, and a code of honor so strict it shaped the very future of Europe. Let's dismantle the myth of the horned helmet. No archaeological evidence supports it. The true Viking wore iron helmets, often simple, conical, or spectacle designs, built for battle, not opera. This distinction is critical because it grounds them in military realism, not fantasy. The driving force behind their explosion was not innate barbarism, but systemic violence coupled with opportunity. Their society, based on the Old Norse religion, valued physical courage and a violent, glorious death, Valhalla, as the ultimate honor, a belief system that was the perfect psychological fuel for warfare and high-risk voyages. Focus on the berserkers, berserkir. They were not just madmen. They were a terrifying, chemically or psychologically induced weapon, whose tactical function was to break the enemy's line through sheer, terrifying momentum. This was a sophisticated, if uncontrolled, psychological warfare tool, used to demoralize Christian forces who believed them possessed by demons. The berserker was the ultimate manifestation of the Vikings' cunning for fear, but the key to the entire Viking Age was not their axes, but their ships. The Longship, was the single most advanced piece of military technology in 9th century Europe. It was the ultimate vehicle for asymmetrical warfare, a marvel of naval architecture built using the clinker-built technique where planks overlapped, making the hull light, flexible, and immensely strong against the brutal North Sea waves. Its design was radical because it had an exceptionally shallow draft, mean NTC. This meant they could bypass coastal defenses, sail hundreds of miles up shallow rivers like the Seine or the Thames, and land virtually anywhere. They could strike deep inland, even dismantling the ship to portage around waterfalls and reassembling it on the other side. They turned the internal rivers of Europe into Viking highways. Furthermore, they were masters of dual power, proficient under both sail, using square sails to cross the ocean quickly, and ore, using up to 30 pairs of oars for speed and maneuverability in river estuaries. This versatility meant they were never truly becalmed and could outrun virtually any enemy. The Longship was the literal engine of the Viking Age. It transformed Scandinavian farmers and chieftains into a global force, a tool for raiding, but also a platform for exploration, trade, and ultimately colonization. Without the Longship, the Vikings would have remained local skirmishers. With it, they became the masters of the known world's waterways simultaneously. Their sophisticated social structure provided the organization necessary for these large-scale movements. Viking society was rigid but pragmatic, divided into three main classes detailed in the Rigskulla: the Jarls, the aristocracy, and leaders who commanded the ships; the Carls, the free men, farmers, and the military backbone who owned property. The year is 793 AD. The place, Lindisfarne, a quiet holy island off the coast of Northumbria, the spiritual heart of Anglo-Saxon England. On a summer morning, the longships appeared, slicing through the mist like silent, deadly phantoms. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a detonation. The attack on Lindisfarne Priory was the official starting gun of the Viking Age, an act of such calculated blasphemy and brutality that it sent shockwaves across Christian Europe. Monks were slaughtered, relics were defiled, and the monastery's gold and silver, the accrued wealth of centuries, was stripped clean. This act exposed a critical vulnerability. The Christian kingdoms had centralized their wealth in undefended monastic sites, an irresistible target for a highly mobile, pagan, and opportunistic enemy. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, and the Northmen would not respect God or king. The raids that followed were initially swift, terrifying hit-and-run operations, designed for maximum profit and minimal risk, striking coastlines, then retreating before any meaningful defense could be mounted. But the ambition quickly escalated. By the mid-9th century, the raids matured into full-scale invasion forces. The Vikings realized they could extract more long-term wealth through tribute than through mere plunder. This tribute was known as Danegeld, literally, Dane gold, a protection racket on a national scale. Kings, paralyzed by internal rivalries and lacking centralized armies, paid vast sums of silver to secure temporary peace, inadvertently funding the continued military expansion of their enemies. This system perfectly illustrates the Vikings' shift from opportunistic pirates to sophisticated financial and political operators. The tribute was massive, requiring an enormous transfer of wealth that destabilized local economies and further enriched the Viking War. Chests. The true paradigm shift came in 865 AD with the arrival of the great heathen army. This was no longer a scattering of summer raiding parties. This was a unified, cohesive army composed of thousands of men, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, figures often mythologized, but terrifyingly real in their military effectiveness. Their goal was not silver, but settlement and conquest. They operated like a professional standing army, utilizing horses captured in England to move swiftly across the landscape. They dismantled the weak Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, piece by piece, first seizing York, Jorvik, and establishing it as a massive permanent trade and military stronghold. They systematically dismantled Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. The Christian kingdoms were unprepared for a war of attrition, built around long-term occupation. The fate of England hung entirely on the efforts of Alfred the Great of Wessex. Alfred was the only Anglo-Saxon king to successfully adapt to the new, relentless warfare. He didn't just fight. He fundamentally reformed the state. He established a network of fortified towns called burhs, creating defensive depth and safe havens for his people. He centralized the military levy, the fyrd, and crucially, he started building his own fleet, meeting the Vikings on their own terms. Alfred's decisive victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD did not expel the Vikings entirely, but it forced a political compromise, the Treaty of Wedmore. This treaty formalized the partition of England, carving out a huge territory under Viking control known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw was not merely an occupied zone. It was a culturally unique region where Viking law, language, and customs prevailed, forever altering the social and political landscape of England. This demonstrates the ultimate success of the Viking project. The Northmen transitioned from invaders to settlers and rulers. The expansion was not confined to Britain. To the south, the Viking impact on the Frankish kingdoms, modern-day France, was equally devastating. The Longships sailed up the Seine and the Loire with impunity, terrorizing the fractured Carolingian Empire. The most famous example is the Siege of Paris in 885 to 86 AD. Hundreds of ships and perhaps 40,000 Vikings besieged the city, which was then confined to the Isle de la Cite. The siege lasted over a year and was a terrifying demonstration of Viking endurance and military organization. Ultimately, the Emperor Charles the Fat was forced to pay another massive Danegeld and grant the Vikings passage to raid further upstream, a capitulation that destroyed the emperor's authority and highlighted the Frankish state's utter impotence against the mobile threat. This pattern of raid, tribute, and negotiation culminated in 911 AD, when Charles the Simple granted the Viking chieftain Rollo a vast tract of land in exchange for a vow to protect the Frankish coasts from other Vikings. This land became Normandy, the land of the Northmen, a historical irony where the Viking descendants were now integrated into the European political system, setting the stage for the next great invasion of England. Centuries later, even the distant shores of the Mediterranean were not safe. Viking fleets sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, raiding coastal areas of Spain, both Christian and Islamic territories, North Africa, and even reaching the Byzantine ports in Italy. These were longer, higher-risk campaigns, often lasting years, showcasing their incredible navigational resilience and global reach. They learned to fight the diverse armies of the Moors and the decentralized forces of the fragmented post-Roman world. The Vikings were not confined to the cold north. They were a systemic geopolitical shockwave reverberating across the entire established order of the Western world. They were adaptable, learning to transition seamlessly from the swift, brutal raid to the long-term, politically savvy siege, and ultimately to the permanent foundation of new kingdoms. Their success was a brutal lesson in military mobility and economic opportunism. While the Anglo-Saxons trembled under the weight of the Danelaw in the west, another, equally significant, wave of Scandinavian expansion was reshaping the east. These were the Varangians, primarily Vikings of Swedish origin, who did not seek coastal settlements, but control over the great river highways of Eastern Europe. Their story is less about the axe and more about the silver dirham and the Silk Road. Their objective was the immense wealth of the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East. The prize was Constantinople, the jewel of the known world, and the Abbasid Caliphate, the source of almost limitless silver. The journey was daunting, utilizing the vast river systems of the Dnieper, the Volga, and the Dina, connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. These rivers were treacherous, marked by rapids, portages where entire longships had to be dragged overland by brute force, and ambush points by hostile local tribes. The Vikings mastered this environment, turning natural obstacles into strategic choke points for trade and tribute. This economic drive led to the formation of a political entity that would eventually become Russia, Kievan Rus. The traditional historical narrative credits the Viking chieftain Rurik with establishing the first ruling dynasty in Novgorod. Around 862 AD, This was not a conquest in the typical sense, but a political imposition where the Slavic tribes, weary of internal conflict, invited or allowed the Northmen to govern and protect their lucrative trading routes. The Vikings, or the Rus as they were known, became the ruling class, taxing the flow of goods and people. They were merchants with swords, ensuring stability for maximum profit. The focus quickly shifted south to Kiev, a strategic settlement on the Dnieper, controlling the critical route to the Black Sea, and crucially, to Constantinople. The Rus were masters of the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, bringing furs, honey, wax, and most significantly, slaves, thralls, from the northern forests down to the Byzantine markets. This was a brutally profitable and central pillar of the Viking economy. The trade in human chattel was global in scale. The staggering amount of Arab silver coinage, dirhams, found in Viking hordes across Scandinavia and the Baltics, far outweighing any Western European coinage, is the silent, metallic proof of the magnitude of this Eastern trade network. The ultimate destination for many of these Eastern Vikings was the unparalleled opulence of Constantinople Miklagard, the great city. The Vikings first attempted to take the city by force, launching massive naval assaults in 860 AD and later. These direct attacks failed against the formidable Theodosian walls and the terrifying weapon of Greek fire. However, the Byzantines quickly realized the strategic value of their fierce adversaries. They didn't defeat them, they hired them. This gave rise to the Varangian Guard, an elite, heavily armed unit of Viking and other Northmen mercenaries who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. They were known for their towering height, their fearsome double-sided axes, and their unwavering loyalty, not to the Byzantine state, but to the emperor himself, who paid them generously in gold. The Varangian Guard was an institutionalized mechanism for transferring Viking military prowess into the heart of the world's most sophisticated empire, giving the Vikings a geopolitical access they could never have achieved by conquest alone. This role transformed the perception of the Vikings from mere raiders to professional, if brutal, security contractors on a global stage. The Varangians, now exposed to Byzantine Christianity, Roman legal structure, and Oriental goods like silk, spices, and wine, began to change. Their culture, while retaining its Viking core, became increasingly hybridized. The establishment of the Rus state, while initially a loose collection of trading posts, set the stage for the formal Christianization of the region under Vladimir the Great of Kiev in 988 AD. This was not merely a religious conversion. It was a sophisticated political maneuver, aligning the emerging Rus state with the massive economic, legal, and cultural power of Constantinople. The ultimate effect of the Eastern push was that the Vikings, through their economic genius and military service, helped lay the fundamental political and cultural groundwork for the eventual formation of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Their impact was permanent, foundational, and ultimately transforming a complete and utter integration into the very systems they initially sought only to plunder. The East provided the Vikings not just with wealth, but with a lasting institutional legacy. While the Varangians were charting the river highways of the East, and the great heathen army was reshaping the politics of the West, a third, arguably most audacious, front of Viking expansion was conquering the vast, terrifying emptiness of the North Atlantic. This was the age of true exploration, driven by land hunger, political exile, and a sheer navigational genius unmatched until the age of discovery centuries later. The key to this success was their ability to perform ocean-going navigation without the magnetic compass. They relied on knowledge passed down through generations, detailed observation of the sun, stars, winds, and crucially, wildlife. They followed bird migration patterns and even released ravens to guide them to land, a stark testament to their pragmatic brilliance. The first major conquest was Iceland. Discovered accidentally by stray sailors, Iceland was not raided, but permanently colonized in a massive wave starting around 870 AD. The driving force was not plunder, but political dissent. As kings like Harald Fairhair consolidated power in Norway, free farmers who refused to surrender their autonomy packed their families and belongings onto longships and sailed west to establish a society based on pure, unadulterated Viking law. The result was the Icelandic Commonwealth, a unique political entity with no central king. It was ruled by the Althing, one of the world's earliest parliamentary bodies, where every free landholder could debate and adjudicate disputes. The Icelandic sagas, the literary treasures detailing the lives and explorations of figures like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, were written here. Iceland was a laboratory of pure Viking culture, law, and history. Uncorrupted by Christian Europe. From Iceland, the push continued further into the desolate reaches of the Arctic. Around 985 AD, Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, charted a course west and discovered the massive, icy landmass he shrewdly named Greenland, a calculated act of marketing designed to attract settlers. Two major settlements, the eastern and western, were established in the only habitable fjords, supporting a peak population of up to 5,000 people. This was colonization pushed to the absolute ecological limit. The settlers survived for nearly 500 years by relying on a delicate balance of livestock farming and the highly dangerous, vital hunting of seals and migratory whales. Their ultimate demise centuries later long, after the Viking Age ended, serves as a chilling precursor to the Maya collapse, a testament to ecological overspecialization and their inability to adapt to the climatic shift of the Little Ice Age, which cut off supply lines from Europe and froze their vital hunting grounds. They starved, surrounded by ice and unyielding law, but the boldest leap came from Greenland. Led by Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, Viking expeditions pushed even further west, sighting and landing on the coast of North America. They named the lands they encountered Helluland, Flatstone Land, likely Baffin Island, Markland, Forest Land, likely Labrador, and finally Vinland, Wineland or Pasture Land, generally agreed to be Newfoundland. This was a genuine monumental transatlantic discovery centuries before Columbus. Crucially, this is not myth. It is confirmed by the discovery of the archaeological site Lonsell Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. Excavations have uncovered definitive Viking artifacts, a bronze cloak pin, iron rivets, and evidence of carpentry and iron smelting, proving that a temporary, intentional Viking settlement existed here around 1000 AD. The sagas speak of intense conflict with the local indigenous people, whom the Vikings called Skrallings, likely an insulting term meaning wretches or screamers. The Skrallings were numerous and fiercely protective of their territory, and unlike the scattered English forces, they were not impressed or intimidated by the Viking longships or armor. The failure of the Vinland experiment, despite the navigational success, is profoundly revealing. It demonstrated that even the superior Viking military technology and organizational genius were not invincible when facing a unified, resilient indigenous population on their home turf. The logistics of supplying such a distant colony, coupled with the relentless pressure from the Skrallings, proved too costly and too dangerous. The Vikings retreated, but their discovery of North America remained in their cultural memory, a testament to a global reach that stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean, through the heart of Russia, and across the vast emptiness of the world's largest ocean to the soil of a new continent. They were not just raiders. They were the first truly global network of explorers and entrepreneurs, pushing the geographic and political boundaries of the world to their absolute limit. The very success of the Vikings contained the seeds of their demise. As their raids morphed into trade, and trade morphed into permanent settlement, the fierce independence and paganism that fueled their initial expansion became a political liability. The fractured kingdoms they once terrorized began to consolidate power, learning the lessons of centralization from Alfred the Great and others. The shift was driven by two powerful converging forces: political necessity and religious conversion. Kings in Scandinavia realized that to be accepted into the powerful, established network of European monarchs to gain access to lucrative diplomatic ties and massive trading networks, they had to adopt the dominant religion, Christianity. This was not merely a spiritual choice. It was a cold, calculated political maneuver. The process of Christianization in Scandinavia was slow, complex, and often extremely brutal, taking place over 2 centuries. It began at the elite level. Figures like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who proudly claimed to have Christianized his people, used conversion to legitimize their rule, aligning themselves with the Holy Roman Empire and powerful bishops. Kings were instrumental, forcing the conversion of their subjects often at the point of the sword, because Christian law supported the concept of a strong, centralized monarchy, something the old decentralized Viking system of the Thing often resisted. This religious shift had massive social consequences. It undermined the entire pagan cosmology that fueled the Viking warrior ethos, replacing the warrior heaven of Valhalla with the quiet paradise of the Christian God. This diminished the psychological imperative for a glorious, reckless death in battle. Furthermore, it provided a unified cultural identity that helped to solidify the loose Viking territories into the recognizable, centralized kingdoms of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The very act of becoming Christian ended the core identity of the Viking, a term derived from the act of raiding. This period of conversion and centralization culminated in a final, climactic collision between the old Viking world and the new feudal order. The symbolic end of the Viking Age is commonly marked by the pivotal year 1066 AD, a year defined by 3 battles for control of England. The key event was the invasion led by Harald Hardrada of Norway, often considered the last great Viking king, a towering figure whose life included service in the Varangian Guard and exile across multiple empires. Hardrada represented the final, unadulterated expansionist impulse of the North. His invasion force landed in Yorkshire, aiming to resurrect the Viking hegemony over England. He was confronted by the English king Harold Godwinson, who had to race his forces hundreds of miles north. The ensuing Battle of Stamford Bridge was brutal and decisive. Hardrada's forces were utterly routed. The death of Harald Hardrada on the battlefield in 1066 was, in essence, the death of the last great pagan warrior king, ending the era of spontaneous, large-scale Scandinavian invasion. But the story of 1066 is complex because the true inheritor of the Viking spirit was already waiting. Just weeks after the victory at Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson had to race his exhausted army south to face the final, ultimate invasion, the Norman conquest led by William the Conqueror. William was not a Saxon. He was the Duke of Normandy, the direct political and genetic descendant of the Viking chieftain Rollo, the same Rollo who was granted land after the siege of Paris centuries earlier. The Normans were Vikings who had fully assimilated, adopting French language, Catholic Christianity, and a new, highly effective system of centralized, feudal warfare built around heavy cavalry. The Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066, marked not the end of Scandinavian influence, but its total transformation. The Viking spirit of military effectiveness, organizational genius, and geopolitical ambition did not die. It simply adopted a new, feudal, Christian uniform and seized the prize, the English crown, becoming fully integrated into the European political machine. The Northmen stopped being external destroyers and became internal state builders. Their energy was channeled, their power codified, and their destiny tied irrevocably to the future of the continent. The era of the Longship raid was over. The era of the armored knight, born from Viking ambition, had begun. The longboats have finally been hauled ashore, the axes silenced, and the pagan kings buried under Christian crosses. The Viking Age officially ended with the crushing defeat at Stamford Bridge. But the immense, systemic impact of the Northmen did not simply vanish. It was permanently absorbed, woven into the very fabric of the nations they once terrorized. Their legacy is not just one of violence and conquest, but one of law, language, commerce, and profound genetic influence. The Vikings were the ultimate historical catalyst, forcing Europe out of the localized, fragmented Dark Ages and towards the centralized, maritime future. Their most pervasive, yet often invisible, legacy is found in the English language. The profound mixing of Old Norse with Old English during the 2 centuries of the Danelaw occupation fundamentally shaped the modern vocabulary. Thousands of common, everyday words are direct contributions from the Vikings, words that sit at the core of our syntax. Sky, egg, ship, law, take. Give, call, anger, husband, knife, birth, die. Even the pronouns they, them, and there are a Norse gift, replacing the cumbersome Old English forms. The Vikings simplified the complex grammar of Old English, creating the more flexible and modern structure we use today. This is the quietest, yet most enduring monument to the Viking presence. They didn't just conquer the land. They conquered the language. Beyond language, the Vikings' influence on law and governance was immense. The concept of the thing, the democratic assembly of free men, was exported, directly influencing the legal practices in Iceland and setting a long-term precedent for public law. The establishment of Jorvik, York, and other settlements under the Danelaw brought a structured, pragmatic approach to land ownership and trade that contrasted sharply with the more arbitrary Saxon customs. The Norman conquest, carried out by the great-grandchildren of Vikings, introduced this rigorous legal and feudal structure to England, creating the centralized English state that would eventually build its own empire centuries later. The Normans brought the Viking genius for organization, applied now to castles and chancelleries instead of longships and raids, the most physical. Scientific legacy of the Vikings is written in human DNA. Genetic research across the North Atlantic is undeniable. Studies show distinct Scandinavian genetic markers throughout the British Isles, particularly in Scotland, Ireland, and the regions of the former Danelaw. Furthermore, the genetic footprint stretches east. The populations of the Baltic states and the founders of the Kievan Rus carry clear evidence of Norse admixture, a testament to the scale of their trade, settlement, and slaving networks. The modern world is literally populated by the descendants of the Northmen. They did not just change borders. They changed the biological map of Europe. And finally, we confront the enduring modern myth of the Viking. Why do they still captivate us? Why do their sagas and the imagery of the Longship resonate so powerfully a millennium later? Because the Vikings embodied a timeless human impulse, the freedom from authority, the courage to face the unknown ocean, and the ambition to rewrite your own destiny through sheer force of will. They represent the ultimate triumph of mobile, decentralized power over static, entrenched authority. They forced a continent to adapt, to unify, and to defend itself, inadvertently triggering the very political centralization that ultimately absorbed them. They proved that a civilization is only as strong as its weakest point, and that true power lies in adaptability and mastery of the environment. The Viking Age was a violent, complex, and transformative chapter in human history. It was a cycle of raiding, trading, exploration, and assimilation that redefined the geopolitical landscape from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North America. The longships are gone, the pagan gods are silent, and the great kings are dust. But their spirit remains etched in our language, our laws, and our DNA. The Northmen may have stopped raiding 1,000 years ago, but they're powerful. Undeniable influence will continue to define the history of the world for the millennia to come. Ye Vikings are gone, but their relentless spirit, the constant drive to explore, to innovate, and to conquer the seemingly impossible, that spirit lives on. It is the core engine of human history. If this deep dive into the true Viking Age left you looking at the ocean differently, if it changed the way you think about empire, economics, and the fragility of civilization, then you are now part of the Chronosphere Academy. We break down the world's most epic and complex historical sagas into raw, fact-driven narratives. Don't let the next great collapse or the next great empire go untold. Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell to join us as we unlock the next definitive documentary that history tried to bury. Thank you for watching. And remember, history is not dead. It's just waiting to be told.